Well, hello, good morning, everyone. If it's morning where you are, welcome to the first part of a very special mini-series, a webinar mini-series hosted in partnership with the three groups you see on the screen today: the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, Transcelerate, and the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI. But before we get started, let's do a little bit of housekeeping here. So true to all of DIME's events, this is live, where all the fun stuff will happen. Now, slides and recordings will be available for everyone right after this session. It'll be available on our website. And then going along with the live session here is that the fun stuff happens with the Q&A portion. So if you're on the line today, anyone is welcome to ask questions live. To do so, please raise your hand in the reactions bit, and I can unmute you to ask your question live if you're in a place where you can unmute yourself and talk. Or of course, always type your question into the chat box. Okay, great. So returning back to why we're all here for this exciting series today. A lot of the questions that I get from a lot of folks in the digital health, digital medicine field is, who do I follow for information? Who are the people that I should be listening to, should be getting really great advice from? My personal and very unbiased opinion is the three groups that you see on the screen today. Some of the questions that I also get is, what's the difference between all these different groups? Digital medicine and digital health has been booming in the past several years, and there's lots of folks in this space. But where can we get the best kind of information? Lots of groups doing great things, but I think what we're here today is to learn what's going on at these three fantastic organizations. Now, some of the question is, okay, great groups, but what's actually going on? Are people sort of doing double work? Happily, with the groups on here, no, not at all. We have all been part of the same kind of family here, working together for a long time, many years. And this webinar today is to show an update on what everyone's doing, to show the difference between the different groups, and also how we're all working together, arm in arm, to build the future of digital endpoints together. So we're with great hands today, giving us really fantastic walkthrough of what's going on. And we'll do some self-introductions here. But we'll start here, of course, with DIME. So I am Rachel Chassie, the Director of Innovation for the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. And giving the DIME viewpoint today is our CEO, Jennifer Goldsack. Afterwards, we'll transition to hearing more from Michelle Kruthommel, who is representing Transcelerate today, and then we'll round it out with a fantastic presentation from Lindsay Kehoe from CITI. DIME. Jen, I just looked at you and just called you DIME. Oh, Lord. Jen, would you mind giving yourself an introduction to the team?
I'd be happy to. And Rachel, thanks for joining us today and moderating this really sort of exciting first session in the series. As you said, that's a collaboration between DIME, Transcelerate, and CITI. So as Rachel said, my name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. As we are the lead presenters today in this first series, I'll keep my intro short and tell you a little bit more about DIME when we dive in. So Michelle, let me hand the ball to you if I can.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jen, for this great opportunity to actually work together. So I'm Michelle Kajamo. I head up our digital science group at AbbVie, and that's my day job. But in parallel, I had such a great privilege working with Transcelerate in the past 3 years, leading a team called Novel Digital Endpoint Team. It is actually a sub-team under patient technology. And for folks who don't know much about Transcelerate, no, it is a pharmaceutical industry-focused consortia. We mainly focus on the area in the pre-competitive space to identify whether there's opportunity to develop tools or publishing recommendations from the thought leadership or the industry practice perspective, or even a collective knowledge to actually help the industry as a whole to accelerate drug development program. So thank you for having me today. Should we hand over to Lindsay?
Perfect. Yeah, Lindsay.
Wonderful. Well, good morning for some and afternoon for others. I'm Lindsay Kehoe. I'm one of the project managers here at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And down the road here today, I will provide a little bit more information about CITI as I tell you a little bit about what's to come ahead from our group. But just an honor to be here, echoing both Michelle and Jen. And I think we've all been in this together, have gotten some great collaboration from our current project work with both of the individuals that you see on the screen from both Jen and Michelle. So happy to kind of continue to work with everybody in the future. Thanks, Jen.
Perfect, team. All right, let's go ahead and start rocking and rolling. What we all came here for. Jen, you've got the floor.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. So what I want to do just to get started is sort of set the stage. And for folks who don't know too much about our organization, the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, I thought I'd pause just for a second and introduce us. So DIME's actually structured as a professional society. So we have thousands of members from around the world, experts from a variety of different disciplines that must be at the table to effectively move our field forward. And together we're committed to advancing the safe, effective, equitable and ethical use of digital medicine to optimize health. And this is an ambitious and a broad mission. And we do this by sort of listening very carefully to our members, to understanding where the pain points are as they pursue our mission. Once we understand where those pain points are or where those opportunities are and where an organization can come in and allow us to be more than the sum of the parts as we address these challenges, we'll set up a variety of different research initiatives. Our research initiatives are very intentionally action-oriented, and we have a strong commitment to clinical quality work on a tech timeline. This field is moving quickly, and so are we. After we sort of conduct this research, after we initiate these projects, we spend a lot of time and energy. It's critically important that these aren't just resources that sit on the shelf, but through communication and education, we make sure that they get into the hands of every single individual working towards advancing the field. And then our community is sort of more skilled. We've been responsive to their needs, and then we look at the next suite of issues that we need to be diving into. And today we'll be sort of giving a little bit of an outline of the variety of different initiatives, projects, resources that we've built and made available here at DIME to support the field in developing and deploying successfully novel digital endpoints. And I'm really delighted to be doing this with our Transcelerate and our City colleagues. As Rachel mentioned, it's really, really important that everyone on the line knows how collaborative we are across these organizations, that we're constantly talking about, what are the greatest challenges we're seeing? How are we sort of addressing those? How are our initiatives more than the sum of the parts? How are they complementary? And if we look at this slide here, it's probably not the slide you expected to see as we got started, but this is particularly important as there's enormous investment in the field. There's a lot of innovation happening. It's happening disparately, it's happening quickly. It's critically important that DIME, Transcelerate and City stand shoulder to shoulder and are consistent in our messaging around what good looks like. We can see that as we look to the future as well, this collaboration, this sort of partnership, this cooperation, it's not just for today, it's looking into the future. We can look at the size of the field as it's projected. There's certainly an awful lot of appetite for this kind of work. How can we make sure at DIME, at Transcelerate, at City, that we are being good stewards of the field and supporting all of you working every day to try and make sure that this investment, this value is actually realized from the point of view of the patients that we're all here to serve. We can also look at some other factors that we can think of as sort of driving the field along. Our colleagues at STAT and sort of in the media generally will tell us that healthcare is undergoing a monumental shift towards remote patient monitoring. We can see that in recent months, 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world have announced new remote monitoring technologies. There's a lot of activity here. It's critically important that we stand together and sort of co-define what good looks like for the betterment of patients, and also make sure that we are consistent in that messaging. All of that said, there's all of this growth, there's all of this investment, there's all of this activity. Why is it actually important? Why is an organization like ours, DIME, that's dedicated to using these tools to optimize human health, why are we so committed to this? I think it's really important to start with some tangible patient examples before we dive into the resources that we make available to you here at DIME. The first example, and these are 3 examples that if you've heard me speak before, you may have heard me mention, but they really stand out to me as being critically important. For folks who may not know, if a patient needs a bone marrow transplant, oftentimes they are pulled into clinic visits simply to monitor vitals and ensure that they are stable enough for that surgery, up to 5 times in the preceding 2 weeks. This, to me, is unacceptable, borderline unethical at this point, in my opinion, and happy to have some conversations around this if necessary. For these sorts of needs, very clear clinical and patient needs to actually monitor vital signs to make sure that patients are strong and stable through the course of their treatment or as they prepare for a surgery, as in this example, there's absolutely nothing stopping us from a sort of technical point of view from capturing all of this information at home. The fact that we are asking patients to come into the clinic time and time again to take measurements that we can very readily deliver to them with high quality and high certainty and high integrity and high safety at home. The fact that we burden them with that stress, the fact that we ask their care partners to do even more at a time that's extraordinarily stressful does not seem right at all. We have to get better at bringing these technical capabilities to bear. We can think about boys and young men with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And if you're not familiar with the natural history of this particular condition, typically this Duchenne's is a condition that affects boys and young men. Typically, they're diagnosed at around 7 or 8 years of age. They are sadly, unfortunately, often wheelchair bound by the time they're about 13 or 14. And with no disease modifying therapies available, sadly, average life expectancy is in the low 20s. The gold standard measure for this currently is the 6-minute walk test. It's been augmented by things like the 4-stair test. We could also do muscle biopsies, which are incredibly invasive procedures. We have seen some advancement with digital measures with the 95th centile stride velocity. That is exciting from the point of view of innovation. I have questions about the 60% of boys and young men who are already confined to a wheelchair, that measure is simply not applicable to. If we don't have a high quality measure, those boys, those young men are excluded from sort of medical product development. We can think about critically important measures like of quality of life. You can imagine, can these boys do their homework? Can they text their friends? Can they play video games? Can they feed themselves? Can they take themselves to their toilet? These kids are in middle school and we are doing nothing to measure those important facets of their life. We can and we must do better. And the final one I wanted to highlight is Parkinson's disease. We currently have a sort of blunt instrument, quite frankly, that was validated in the 1990s that we rely upon to assess sort of progress and condition and responsiveness to new therapies in Parkinson's disease. In addition, for patients living with Parkinson's, oftentimes they're diagnosed about 4 or 5 times before they get that accurate diagnosis. And then once they are, 40% of Americans with Parkinson's disease will pass away before they ever see a neurologist. Why? Because of the maldistribution of the specialist neurologists and the patient who need them. These are the reasons that we need these digital measures, and these are the reasons that this cooperation across DIME, across Transcelerate, across City are so important, so that we can support you bringing these measures to bear to serve these patients as quickly as possible. This is also another slide that was actually originally developed by our colleagues at Evidation, and we've incorporated it into our work on the Playbook, which we'll get to a little bit later. We can see that currently when in medical product development, we rely on those sort of episodic data points that you can see sort of above the line here, data collected from traditional clinic visits. And what these sort of sensor technologies, what these novel digital endpoints actually offer us is a huge amount of information to make better decisions that give us much, much more insight into the patient's sort of experience of their condition with and without therapy. This is incredibly exciting. This is another reason that bringing these measures, these endpoints to bear will help us. It also always gives me pause to think about, you know, are we actually measuring what matters? Are we doing a good job of identifying facets of conditions that we ought to be taking the time to measure? Are we confident in the quality of that data, of that information that we're collecting to make sure that this is high quality information that we can use to make better decisions and improve the lives of patients, and to make incredibly sure that we're simply not adding to the noise? That's another piece of this that I think is really important as we look across our organizations and the resources we make available to you. So let's actually think about what current state is. And I always like to take a little bit of a step back to give folks a sense of how far we've come in this field. So in fact, with Rachel, our Director of Innovation, who's our moderator, we actually launched the DIME's crowdsourced library of digital endpoints in October of 2019. And when we launched this, we were absolutely beside ourselves. There were these 12 sponsors were using these products. We could see that there were 34 unique endpoints being used in industry-sponsored trials of new medical products. These aren't feasibility studies, these aren't pilots, they're actually being used to answer questions about the efficacy of new products. We were so excited, in fact, that we went ahead, we published this Stat News article. This is not the stuff of the future, we thought, this is here today. Fast forward to our most recent updates in, I actually had to look at the footnote, June 27th of this year. Enormous growth. We've gone from 12 to 62 sponsors have now collected digital endpoints in trials of new medical products. We can see that we're up to 207 unique endpoints spread across a variety of different new medical products, with over half of these being used in phase 2 or phase 3 trials, and just under a third being primary endpoints. This is enormous growth, enormous progress. But it does give me pause. Quite frankly, I don't think there are 207 interesting things to measure. This is our endpoints library as an open source resource. The database is available on the DIME website. You can mine it, you can probe it, you can look by technology type, you can look by phase of trial, you can look by type of therapeutic area. All of this information is available to you, but what you will see is that there are over 50 different measures of sleep and over 60 different measures of activity. And while I'm absolutely certain that there's not just one perfect measure of sleep for all conditions, in fact, I take a strong position that there's absolutely not, maybe 4 or 5, certainly not 54, and certainly not 60 something sort of measures of activity. We have to do better at aligning the enormous hard work, the enormous effort, the enormous investment by our community into these measures to actually hone their focus, to drive at the things we collectively agree are the best for patients. And that's where I'll start sort of making a transition from a little bit of background and why we at DIME believe this is so important into the resources we make available to you. And perhaps one of the most important publications that we've made at DIME, we were lucky enough to do with colleagues at Human First and also at Evidation Health. We put together a sort of a framework to help you recognize, when does a measure matter to patients? We have to start with the unmet patient and clinical need for new information. Let's think back to what I describe as that iceberg slide. We want to make sure that everything sitting underneath, all of these new flows of data, high velocity data that we now have access to, is actually yielding actionable information. And we have an example, quite recent example, of where this hasn't gone so well. And our Verily colleagues actually took the part 3 of the UPDRS, which is the Universal Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. Part 3 is the mobility section, and they did tremendous technical work. They really did terrific sort of measurement engineering, and were able to make digital that section of the UPDRS. Terrific piece of technology. Unfortunately, colleagues at FDA said, look, we actually don't think that there's sufficient evidence that tells us that measuring the part 3 of the UPDRS is sufficiently meaningful to patients. I think our colleagues at Verily, who did great technical work, have actually taught us a very, very important lesson. As we go back to those 207 unique endpoints, we have to focus our efforts, and we have a framework available to you to help you do that on those measures that matter most. So sort of, I think that's an important bellwether of where we are as a field. I'm of the opinion starting with the patients and being collaborative is going to be a great way for us to make some forward progress here. And then once we're certain, once we're confident that we are measuring the right thing, how do we actually go ahead and sort of evaluate these digital clinical measures? There were 2 really, really important, apparently I'm feeling quite jazzed up today. There were 2 important manuscripts that came out of DIME early on that were absolutely sort of foundational to the work that we've done here and we've referenced highly. The first is the V3 framework, looking at verification, analytical validation, clinical validation to determine whether a measure is actually sort of fit for purpose. And then with our partners at Human First, we actually put together an additional framework that uses V3 as sort of table stakes. Yes, a measure has to be fit for purpose, but what about all of the other technical components that accompany the decision to use a technology to start measuring health? What I thought we'd do is just spend a few minutes going through these resources, although what you'll notice is, and these slides will be available, everything's linked here. All of these resources that myself, Michelle and Lindsay will sort of highlight today will be available to you after the presentation. Everything that we're sharing today is indeed open source. So let's start with V3. As I said, this is intended to help us sort of figure out whether a digital clinical measure is fit for purpose. And it's really important that we sort of pass this out into a modular process. We don't have to have full stack measurement solutions, and we have to be ready and we have to be prepared for our knowledge of what matters for sort of the underlying technology to be evolving over time. So the verification step, much more information about this is available in the manuscript. The verification step is really sort of assessing that the data that comes off the sensor is indeed correct and fit for purpose. Different sorts of measures will require different sorts of resolution. So is the sensor technology measuring and reporting what it says it is? And then that data flow, is that fit for purpose to be the input data for the measure that you're interested in? Then we can think about analytical validation, that process of determining whether the algorithm itself is performing sufficiently well. As it takes that data that comes off the sensor, as it manipulates it and it gives you clinical information, is that clinical information correct? Does that clinical information hold, and is it equally correct across different populations within your intended use or within the context of use? So for example, if you're using a PPG, the green lights on the back of your smartwatch, does that perform well across different skin tones? If you're looking at some measure of sort of mobility, does that perform equally well across your entire population of interest, or are there floor and ceiling effects? And that's the really important part of analytical validation. Is it measuring what you say you're measuring? And then the clinical validation part, and for folks who have a background in this will be most familiar to you. You know, once we have that data, what does it mean? What's clinically meaningful change? What does sort of healthy look like? You know, what sort of changes and what sort of signals would cause us to make a decision? And these three pieces together are critically important. I mentioned the importance of sort of taking a modular approach, and let's just dive into that for a second. Verification will help you if there are changes to hardware and firmware. You'll either have to do re-verification if you don't have sufficient documentation that there's back compatibility as those sort of underlying tools are updated. It also gives you the ability to switch in different pieces of hardware as long as it can be verified, to make sure that you're selecting sort of measurement products that are as appealing and as fit for purpose as the patients you're serving on any given day. We can think about, and there's certainly been stories recently around sort of our software updates changing the algorithm. Are we expanding this to perhaps new populations, and we want to make sure that this holds firm? That's your analytical validation. And then the clinical validation is, you know, let's say that you have looked at something like sleep or sort of gait speed in one population, and you realize that that's a really important meaning or aspect of health to another population. Can you translate that measure wholesale to this new population? Do the cut points, do the sort of minimally clinically meaningful change, do they still hold, or do you need to repeat that top layer of the stack? There's a lot of investment, there's a lot of activation energy, there's a lot of time that goes into developing the full stack of a digital clinical measure and a digital endpoint. The underlying technology, the math that we apply to that data generated by the sensor to make it clinically sort of informative, and then how we act on that information. The more we can do to sort of translate these measures to make them as broadly applicable and as broadly valuable, the more that we're going to be able to benefit, and the more we can accelerate these timelines. And V3 is really important there. There's also a really important part of V3 around who owns these steps. It doesn't all have to happen at the same organization. And in fact, I'd make the argument that we will be more efficient and more effective if we recognize the different experts who have to be at the table. Verification, for example, may seem very intimidating to folks with a more clinical background. But if we think about verification as being something that our electrical engineering colleagues have been doing for decades and decades, and we simply need to collaborate with them, and we need to understand the sort of documentation that they provide, it becomes a lot less intimidating. And this is the pathway we need to pursue in order to make strong forward progress. V3, we put this out, frankly, in early 2020. I think that this was published, and we've seen enormous adoption so far. So to the best of our knowledge, there's only over 45 life sciences companies and sort of measure developers who are referencing V3 in their work. Our colleagues at EMA are also leaning heavily on this framework. We also had a project team from our research committee do some really thoughtful work extrapolating the V3 framework and putting it into conversation with more traditional biomarker approaches from the wet lab. Really, really tremendous resource for you here on the screen if your background is more in the traditional biomarker side of things, to see how the scientific best practice that you've been applying for many years continues to hold as we go digital. And as I said, V3 will tell us if the measure is sort of performing as it should be in a given context of use. It is only the sort of first rung of the ladder, however. We also need to be thinking about the security of the digital product, security being a sort of protections against unauthorized access. We need to be thinking about data rights and governance. Is the authorized access acceptable? And importantly, in research, is it congruent with our informed consent? We need to think about the utility and the usability of these products to the patients and participants, to clinical sites. And something that's often overlooked is the utility and usability of the data that comes off this. Can we integrate it? Can data scientists and biostatisticians actually use this information in a reliable way? And then finally, we could probably play the earth to get the perfect product. We know that we are cost constrained. So what's the economic feasibility of these different products, especially if we need to take them into large scale trials? All right, so there's some other resources that we've developed that I want to take us through. And the evidence checklist is one of our more recently released products that resulted from a very, very powerful tour of duty. Really proud of this work. And again, an important collaboration. The problem we wanted to solve for with the evidence checklist is oftentimes we were aware of folks going to the published literature, trying to understand about the performance of a given algorithm or a given product. And the quality of the reporting wasn't sufficiently good for a scientist or for a researcher to pick up that sort of algorithm or that tool and move forward confidently. In fact, what we started to see was an awful lot of redundant investigations into these products, which not only slow the field, not only are expensive, but we would make the argument are even unethical because we're recruiting the same patients again and again to answer the same question. So in the same way that we have Prisma, for example, for publishing systematic review, Consort for RCTs, we were very proud to publish the evidence checklist to really make sure that as these evaluation studies of digital measurement products are published, that there is sufficient information there for anyone coming to that literature to be able to sort of confidently interpret the performance of the underlying tool. Again, evidence, like all of the other resources we're showing today, the checklist is available to you. It's an open source resource. It's on the DIME website. And then perhaps something that many of you have heard of is actually the Playbook on digital clinical measures. The Playbook has been one of our sort of cornerstones of really advancing the field of digital clinical measures. We are very, very proud of this work. It consolidates not only all of the information I've already shared with you today, but the phenomenal work by our Transcelerate colleagues, the phenomenal work by our City colleagues, and puts it all in one place. We can see, and I'm going to give, we'll do a little video while I chat. We can see that there are, not only is it sort of a comprehensive guide to sort of developing or selecting, developing and deploying these digital clinical measures, we also have over 100 action-oriented resources to support the implementation of the Playbook. The Playbook itself is about 360 slides. This is not an easy process, but we certainly do know how to do it now. And you will find sort of educational curricula, you will find discussion documents, you'll find checklists, you'll find case examples. All of those are brought to bear in the Playbook. And this is an absolutely critical resource to the field, as I said, that consolidates everything you'll hear about today and over the course of the series. Critically importantly with the Playbook doesn't just, and I do air quotes because it's not a small feat, look at the use of these digital clinical measures in medical product development. It also looks across the use of these measures in healthcare and in public health. It doesn't help us if we can hone in on a high quality measure that's shared by our life sciences colleagues, but that Mayo Clinic and Kaiser measure differently, that the CDC and the NIH measure differently. We need to be looking across these different contexts of use. And for folks in the life sciences community, that's critically important if we are serious about ever using real world data derived from these sensor technologies. And in addition to our work on the Playbook, we have a few other initiatives up and running here at DIME that I want to brief you on. But let's pause for a second and look at sort of where we are in healthcare. It may feel tangential, but it's critically important to building trust. It's critically important to really actually understanding the natural history of conditions as measured by these new products. So there was some interesting data, and this is actually data that we built as part of our participation here at DIME in the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition. So this was work that we did with the American Medical Association, American Telemedicine Association, MITA, Mayo Clinic, Change Healthcare, and others. And what we saw was that while there was an increase in telehealth utilization by nearly 1,200% at the height of, maybe we've got another height of the pandemic. In March 2021, we could see that only 11% of those encounters were leveraging digital clinical measures. It's interesting. I don't think 100% of encounters is the right number. Certainly they're not always suitable, but 11% feels low. We recognized that that was sort of a response to the pandemic, but still it gives us really good insight into where we are with actually incorporating these measures routinely into clinical workflows. We can also see that we have data that shares that when we are using these measures in healthcare, 40% of the time the treating clinician is not monitoring that information between visits. That is certainly not a criticism of them, but again, it shows us where we are. We need to dramatically redesign these workflows. If all we're doing is compressing these streams of data into a single snapshot that a clinician only has time to look at as they walk into a visit, whether in person or like this, then I'm of the opinion, quite frankly, let's not bother. The richness in this information comes from continuous monitoring, comes from being responsive, comes from using other members of the care team, practicing at the top of their license to do outreach and management of a patient without having to pull them into a clinic and without requiring a doctor's visit every single time. We address some of these issues in our collaborative community focused on digital health measures. So DataCC is a collaborative community that we're delighted to have FDA participation in, and we launched in just May of this year, and we've actually just announced our 2 priority projects. We are focused on, DataCC broadly focuses on the use of these measures across different settings, across different contexts. So not only sort of public health, research and care, but it also goes beyond just sensor measures. We know from things like GPS data, we know from things like the OnStar in your car that we have enormous, from your Google searches, Bing searches, whatever search engine you use, that we have enormous information on folks. We can measure health and define health in a dramatically different way. How do we think about some of the systemic issues there? How do we move that forward so that we have the infrastructure and the trust in order to bring this to bear across different contexts? The first 2 projects that DataCC will be pursuing are focused on digital inclusion and also standardization of evaluation processes out in the real world, especially when we're using different data streams and especially when we're thinking about digital inclusion. We can also think about another project that we'll be launching at DIME this fall, really focused on data integration. We wrote a stat op-ed, crikey, a year ago now, really sort of speaking about the challenges of so many silos, that when it actually comes time to integrate these data flows, this information into sort of cloud-based platforms, whether that's an EDC on the care side, whether that's an EDC on the trial side, an EHR on the care side, first of all, do we even want them in there in its sort of granular detail, and how do we get it in? How do we make sure that we can ingest the data securely? How do we make sure that it's formatted in a way and that we have the necessary ontologies to make sense of it, that we can actually transform that? And most importantly, the key feature of integration is being able to be reused by multiple users with high integrity, whether that's patients and participants themselves, whether that's the researchers, whether that's the care team, whether that's sort of regulatory colleagues. If we're going to power a learning healthcare system where we collapse the divide between research and care, and we're simply doing the best clinical work for the bringing sort of the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, we need to do in data integration significantly better. And in September, next month, we'll be spinning up a project here on DIME to focus on that across both the research sides and the care sides. At DIME as a professional society, we also spend an awful lot of time focusing on making sure that the workforce needed for success in the digital era of health is appropriately sort of skilled and trained and inclusive. We need to think about big tent thinking to make sure we have a variety of different expertise at the table. We need to make sure that we're integrating sort of different elements into professional training, whether that someone's already in the workforce or whether someone's sort of coming up in their professional training for the first time. We need a bilingual workforce that is comfortable with both tech and clinical work and can collaborate with their colleagues. And perhaps most importantly, when we think about equity going forward, we need to make sure that the digital health workforce appropriately represents the patients that we're all here to serve. So before I hand over to my colleagues at Transcelerate and at Citi, let me just tell you a little bit about how you can get involved with some of this work that we're doing here at DIME. First, as I said, we are a professional society. We welcome several thousand individual members from around the world from a variety of different disciplines who share our mission. So if you are not yet part of DIME, we would be delighted to welcome you. And you can see that there's a link here on your screen, and all of these slides will be posted later. You can also join on the DIME website. There's for DIME members, we have a thriving research committee that is chaired by members, that is led by members, and it really is our grassroots research sort of behemoth. There are currently 7 active projects working across a variety of different issues, from translating some of our work on the Playbook into low resource settings, all the way through to expanding V3 to include usability and utility. An awful lot of work, and you can get involved with those projects as DIME members. Another sort of very exciting initiative we have on deck right now is the Playbook has been phenomenally well adopted. In the first few months last year, after we launched V 1.0, we had over 10,000 downloads of the Playbook. We know that folks are using it. We are building out. We've already got a good number of fantastic use cases highlighting how organizations are using the Playbook in practice. If you are using the Playbook, we would love to spotlight your work and show folks how you are using these resources that collate all of the best practices to inform the best work possible. So certainly let us know if you are using the Playbook. We'd be pleased to spotlight you. And finally, we actually have an open call for DataCC right now. Our 2021 annual call is open through, oh crikey, it's August 9th or 10th, and I can't quite remember, but it's one of the two, and there's a link to apply here and also on the DataCC website at datacc.dimesociety.org. So with that, I took us through a whistle-stop tour of just a selection of the DIME resources that we have on deck, hopefully here to support you in the fantastic work that you are doing to advance novel digital endpoints. And with that, Michelle, let me turn it over to you. I'll drive, so just tell me as you need me to advance the slides.
Okay. Thank you, Jen. And thank you so much for DIME and all the support you have provided to the industry. I really think the industry is very, very greatly benefited from an organization like yours. So, so today I'm just going to give a little teaser from our second webinar that will launch in September timeframe. And so as you all know, Transcelerate right now have about 20 member companies, and pretty much every single companies are very invested in the novel digital endpoint area because we all believe that this new type of measurement could potentially transform the way we develop drugs and can accelerate the medicine development and get the medicine to a patient faster and better. So, we also recognize that the industry cannot continue get stuck at the pilot stage, right? So in order for these novel digital endpoint to truly turn the value for the patient, we really need to be able to have confidence in them and be able to use them to support our drug development and also potentially support the label claim. So in order to do that, as Jan already mentioned, it's surprising and not so surprised. During COVID, you see tons of picked up in the telemedicine, but only 11% of adoption using digital measure. And many of you probably thinking why. And my suspicion is that because these kind of tools, in order for it to actually generate real tangible value in drug development, it really requires validation. And so the V3 framework and all the city work and DIME work is really to try to educate the whole industry how we can do this. And so these tools can truly be beneficial in our effort. So, and from Transeller perspective, we actually, I would say we're the user of a lot of these work that DIME and City have produced, right? So we actually will look at our own drug development pipeline and then learn to apply a lot of these guidance and recommendations, either from the agency perspective or from consortia perspective. And the truth is, FDA have provided a lot of guidance from patient-focused drug development program perspective. And then there's also COA guidance. And most recently, I think they even published a lot of application in their drug development tool qualification program. So all these are wonderful materials. And what we wanted to actually share is that on Transelerate, we are very pleased to announce that we actually created an opinion paper. It is actually developed with a label claim in mind in the rheumatoid arthritis. And we wanted to show that if you have interest in developing a label claim in specific indication context of use, and you have a specific concept of interest for measure, how you can do that. And so that is technically the framework that we have created. And we use a drug development process, the IND pathway, as the guide to show the industry how you can potentially develop an endpoint and a label claim following such process. And all of it is actually building on the tool, the playbook, the V3 framework, and also a lot of CD guidance that has been developed for the industry to adopt. So in the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is be a teaser to actually forecast about what we are going to talk about in depth and about the paper. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight, we are also co-leading and providing an instruction. We call it the short course in the DIA upcoming in October timeframe. So I would highly recommend everyone who is working in this space register, and then we will look forward for your participation in a short course, and we can all learn, all grow together in this space. So with that, that's my part, and I can hand over to Lindsay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Jen. And hello to everybody who's listening in today. City, again, to echo everybody else's comments here, is thrilled to be part of this webinar series. And we will follow suit to Transellerate's talk next. So we will be the third in kind of the lineup of the webinar series, and look forward to that in a few months. For those of you who didn't join us during the intros, again, I'm Lindsay Kehoe. I'm one of the project managers at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And I'm here to provide a little background, not only on our group, but also to provide a glimpse into what City hopes to present as part of this great webinar series. So next slide. And for those who aren't familiar with City, just allow me a quick moment to describe who we are. We're a public-private partnership co-founded by Duke and the Food and Drug Administration, and we're focused on increasing the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. So we do that by bringing together multi-stakeholder teams to really tackle challenges and address unmet needs in the clinical trial space. These teams are really pivotal and help us in the development of evidence-based recommendations and resources. And all of those resources, similar to DIME's resources, are all publicly available on City's website. Next slide. I'd also like to take a quick moment to note that the City recently developed a bold vision called Transforming Trials 2030 for how clinical trials should be done in 2030. And our goal is that all stakeholders can really aspire to achieve this together. So we use this vision now to help guide the priorities in our work moving forward, and we really encourage others to do the same. And as we think about kind of the use of digital health technologies, I think it touches on a number of the principles that you see here on the slide, but they certainly help us achieve, I think, the principles that are focused on being patient-centered and easily accessible, and thinking about ways that we can maximally leverage all available data. Next slide. So as with DIME and Transcelerate, we're all here today because we believe in the benefits of using digital health technologies in trials and to advance medical product development. And as Jen said, even beyond the trial space and into kind of the public health domain and other areas. City has taken on a number of different projects over the years within the digital health trial space. And each of these have their own set of recommendations. You can see here the novel endpoints work came out in 2017. That was kind of the first set of recommendations that were produced. And that is the work that City's really been expanding upon currently, and what we'll focus on when we talk again and meet again in a few months here. Next slide. So that's the initial novel endpoint work really was focused on the selection and the development of endpoints that use a digital health technology for data capture. And I think a lot of this work that you've seen here is just, these are messages that are reiterated throughout the Playbook and throughout some of Transcelerate's work. These are common themes and messages that we all are hopefully starting to grasp and hold on to. Things like focusing on measures that are meaningful to patients. That's the starting point that we've heard drilled into us again and again. And I think that it's important to note here that although these were developed back in 2017, this work has now been out in the public domain for a number of years. And as many of you know, and as Jen had kind of reiterated, there is still a lot of hesitation. Although the endpoint library has really highlighted that there is a big uptick in the use of these digital endpoints or digitally derived endpoints, we certainly know that there's a lot of hesitation and still a lot of use being used in the exploratory phase. And so how can we advance these endpoints to be used more to support label claims and for more medical product development? And that's the opportunity that City really recognized. And so we're taking our work a bit further to appreciate how we can advance the adoption of these and how we can use them to potentially support a label claim. Next slide. And that's what this kind of highlights here. So this slide talks about the current work a bit. And as you can see here, we're just hoping to further the adoption of meaningful DHT-derived endpoints as key endpoints in clinical trials for label claims. And we're doing that by addressing the barriers to adoption and really describing the evidence needed when these endpoints are being used for regulatory decision-making. Next slide. I should also note that this particular work is fairly focused and scoped. It's been focused primarily on clinical outcome assessments. And specifically, we've been focusing a lot on the functional outcomes, including passive and active monitoring, and using technologies that are intended for use in a clinical trial. So things like survey-based measures like ePROs, things like digital therapeutics and biomarkers were out of scope for this particular project, but we are hoping that some of this work is generalizable and can kind of be looked at for other measures as well. But again, just from a project's time standpoint, we have just focused on COAs for this work. Next slide. So yes, as you can see, there's been a lot of opportunity for us to collect a lot of really rich information throughout our project, including things like in-depth sponsor interviews that we had throughout our work. We also just hosted an expert meeting last week and excited to kind of pull and synthesize some of the information that came out of that, that meeting. And so we're hoping when we all meet again to be able to kind of talk with you and share some of the opportunities and the findings that we've had throughout the course of our work, and also maybe provide a sneak peek of our recommendations in a few months here. So stay tuned. Jen, we can go on to the next slide, and you can always follow Citi on Twitter or LinkedIn for notification of when that next webinar registration link will be available. But again, as a reminder, Transcelerate will be sharing some of their work prior to that, and just are thrilled to continue on the conversation. So thanks, Jen.
Of course, Michelle, Lindsay, this was so fun to present with you. And Rachel, I'll hand back to you to moderate us through some Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you all for presenting. Really, really fantastic to really watch the field grow. And before we really dive in with Q&A, this is just another invitation to everyone on the line today to let's use this time. We've got some powerhouse folks on the line today. Right now is this little 10 minutes of privilege right now to ask these questions that you've always been burning to ask on behalf of you and your team. So don't be shy. So seeing all of these resources to me just really is so gratifying to show how much the field has really grown. Those of us who have been in this space for years remember a lot of the early rhetoric saying, oh, well, we can't do this kind of innovation because we don't know how. And there's been no information to help us guide us through, nothing like that. And so as we learned today, I actually never want to hear that excuse ever again. Every single team on this line has worked so hard with folks all across the industry to build these kinds of resources really mindfully to help us all make the best products for patients and to really revolutionize healthcare into a place where we are very proud of. Now, we heard lots of really great resources today, and I'm also struck by Michelle's mention about all of this to help teams not get stuck developing these products, right? And so while I'm thrilled to be able to provide, we're all thrilled to provide all of these resources in the slides, which will be available after today's live recording. My question is sort of, what can we do right now to get started? Teams right now. I'll come to each person on the line today and ask them, what is the foundational offering from your team that you think is the top thing that you would give someone right now who was first trying to do this work and do it in a great way? And we'll do kind of last person in, last person out. So Lindsay, let me give you that question. What's the top resource that you think that you would give folks from Citi?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think Citi tends to start kind of high level with the recommendations. So certainly going onto our website and trying to have a look at our recommendations, and from there doing deeper dives into, we've mapped out a flow chart, which is kind of a steps of that novel endpoint development selection and development process that a lot of folks have reportedly said have been really useful and helpful. There's been even deeper dive into that, a detailed listing of what these steps look like. And so based on the needs of where you are in the development process and what you need, I think the resources are there and available. There's case studies there that can kind of help support and highlight what this might mean in real practice and in real life. And so it really is just dependent on where you are in your place and what resources might be most helpful for you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lindsay. Michelle, what's the top resource you think from Transcelerate teams you can use right now?
Thank you for that question. So Transcelerate, as I mentioned, the novel digital endpoint team actually sit under the team called patient technology. So in the patient technology sort of the website section, you could actually see a lot of the tools that has been developed. Particularly, I think the whole team started with understanding the current challenges actually being identified amongst all the sponsor companies. So recognize you are not alone, right? And this is a tough journey, and understand and learn from all has been shared in these kind of publication will be super helpful as a first step. And the second step is I think we highlight over and over, this is actually almost like a co-development effort with regulatory agency. Recognize that, build that into your process, engage with agency early, take the V3 framework, take the DIME Playbook, and also Citi guidance, take it to heart. And then if you can build in this kind of process in your company trying to develop this, I think you will be less surprised at the end. So I think hopefully it will be a positive surprise when you actually take it to the agency for your final approval. I think the the whole drug development tool qualification process can be mimicked, and that's exactly what we are trying to describe in our paper. Now, you can actually mimic that process in your IND pathway, and that's probably the most important thing I learned throughout my journey in this whole path.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. I also like that comment about how you are not alone. Your team, your company is not alone. We're all figuring this out together. Some folks are a few steps ahead of you, but we've all published things leaving behind breadcrumbs for help. So let's use resources out there and make better products. Jen, I'll let you round us out. And then I think we've got a question from the audience too.
I could be a real brat and just say the playbook because it's like 150 resources and 300 something slides. If I want to actually give useful information, you know, Rach, you make a good point that people are at different points. You ask for foundational. So I think honestly, the framework, the published framework that's also included in the playbook is this, like, does this measure matter to patients? Like, I would say do not even pass go, certainly do not collect 200 if you haven't asked yourself those questions yet and have a lot of proof to support the direction in which you're going. So that would be my answer there.
Thank you for that. I think it's really important. I also love how we kicked off our presentation today, everyone, talking about why we're doing this, why it matters to patients now with real life, real understandable examples. So thank you for that. We are really blazing past now. So we have 4 minutes left. And we have a really fantastic question here from Sunil Soni. If you're available to unmute yourself and ask your question live, that'd be great. But if not, we have it here in the chat to kind of kick off with. Sunil, are you able to unmute? Fantastic. We got him coming online here. Jen, this is a really great question. I think I would actually, I'm going to be selfish and throw to you. It looks like I'll just go ahead and ask it there. So we showed on that slide previously, there's a lot going on with development of these kinds of tools, but Sunil's question is a bit more to be used kind of today in the real world about the maturity, I think, of what's being done and in the field too. So, you know, of all the 217 digital endpoints, how many are actually validated for clinical use, i.e. can be sufficiently used to make therapeutic decisions? That's a loaded question. And I think one that I think a lot of folks too is kind of bottom line. Jen, can you take that for us?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think there's probably two groups that have the positioning to say that. It's our regulatory colleagues and it's the study team themselves. They're the only people who are sort of well positioned enough to answer that. But Sunil, what I would say is, you know, sort that database, sort it by endpoint positioning and sort it by sort of trial phase. I think, you know, what we can infer is, you know, there's really high integrity across our industry. If someone has the confidence to be using this as a primary or secondary endpoint in a later phase trial, we may not be able to see the evidence that they have under the hood. They may be deciding to share that or not, but we can start to say, look, we have colleagues who we respect in the field who have a level of confidence here. And, you know, this gets back to why the evidence checklist is so important. It is really hard to figure out the status of these measures. So wherever we can be publishing about these, we can be putting good, high quality science out into the public domain to support the fact that these measures matter, that the measure itself is sort of performing well, that we understand how to interpret that data, and that the tools that we're selecting to make those measurements are actually secure. The more we can do that, the better.
Thank you for that. Well, I scrambled to unmute myself. Fantastic presentation from everyone on the line today. I'm very excited to continue to watch the field grow. I know that we're in great hands with the great work from Transcelerate, City, Dime, also, and our other friends in the field. So thank you for your time today to give a fantastic overview of the great work that's going and ways for us all to get involved too, big and small. Final 2 minutes here, we're going to jump to the upcoming events from Dime so we can all continue to learn together. So the next Journal Club session is later on this month in August 26th, featuring Eric Daza, a statistician from Evidation, talking about statistical considerations for successful digital health innovation. He's talking about some really unique things that I think that some folks, I would love to get the feedback from some folks, as he's really taught me along the way about usage of some common phrases like statistical significance and how that might be a phrase of the past. And our next event here is the webinar is coming up in September. And I'm very excited for this one because it shows a patient on our panel here to give us a feedback on also how patient engagement can help make digital platforms better. Also hosted with our friends from eTechRx, Janssen, University of Minnesota, and Pack Health. So join us for additional events coming along. But again, final thank you to our fantastic presenters. We have Lindsay Kehoe from Citi and Michelle Kruthummel from TransCelerate, and of course our fearless leader, Jen Goldsack, CEO of Dime. Thank you everyone for presenting and for joining us today live. Thank you everyone.